evening with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. In recent weeks, the Obama administration has been touting a strategy of reconciliation with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Earlier this month, the administration said it was backing peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Speaking at a NATO summit in Brussels, Defense Secretary Robert Gates said the U.S. supports Afghan reconciliation.
We've always acknowledged that reconciliation has to be a part of the solution, ultimately, in Afghanistan, and we will do whatever we can to support that process. I think one of the principles that we have established with President Karzai is transparency with one another as this process goes forward. So we are in very close consultations with President Karzai and the Afghan government.
A few days later, the New York Times reported that U.S.-led forces allowed senior Taliban leaders to enter Afghanistan for meetings with Afghan leaders in Kabul. The Times reported the talks included leaders of three key Taliban factions, including the so-called Quetta Shura, which that paper said oversees the Taliban's war efforts in Afghanistan.
Well, investigative journalist and Democracy Now! Correspondent Jeremy Scahill and Big Noise Films' Rick Rowley have just returned from Afghanistan. They were not embedded for 2 weeks. In a new article in The Nation magazine, Jeremy describes how brutal raids by U.S. Special Operations Forces are sabotaging the political strategy of the Obama administration claims to support in Afghanistan. The article is called Killing Reconciliation. Jeremy Scahill and Rick Rowley join us here in our studio just after returning from Afghanistan. It's great to see you back safe and sound, both of you.
Thank you.
So tell us what's happening in Afghanistan.
Well, first of all, what's abundantly clear from traveling around the Pashtun heartland, the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan are where the Taliban have their strongholds. And also, Rick and I traveled in areas that are really heavily populated by members of the Haqqani network, which is the insurgent group that the United States government most closely identifies with al-Qaeda, with strong links to Pakistan's ISI spy agency. And so we traveled around these areas talking to tribal leadership, to civilians. We even interviewed some current Taliban commanders, as well as former senior members of the Taliban government, including Mullah Zaif, who was the former Taliban spokesperson to Pakistan, the man who after 9/11 really emerged as the public face of the Taliban. He then was taken for 4 years to Guantanamo prison. So much of what Rick and I focused on was trying to get a sense of the nature of the insurgency. And what's abundantly clear is that the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy, the so-called coin doctrine, has utterly failed. The Taliban are gaining in popularity, gaining in strength. The leadership of the Taliban acknowledged that the so-called targeted killing campaign of senior Taliban leadership has been successful, but they say that it's only producing new generations of leaders within the Taliban that are actually more radical than the previous generation. In fact, when we talked to Mullah Zaif, who's under house arrest in Kabul, he has Hamid Karzai's military forces in front of his house, and when we entered there, they went nuts about Rick's camera, and they tried to sort of grab his camera from him, and then we entered Mullah Zaif's house and we interviewed him, and what he was saying is, look, if you kill all of the old school Taliban leaders, people who actually were a part of a government that had diplomatic relations with Muslim countries, that knew how to negotiate, you're not going to like what you create in that, because this new generation, and he said to us, I know this new generation, they're more radical. And evidence of this can be found in the fact that when Mullah Muhammad Omar, who all the Taliban people we talked to is still running the show, still issuing orders through the shadow governors that the Taliban has. All over the country they have a shadow government. And in many cases, local people go to that shadow government instead of the Karzai government because they feel that they're going to get results there. But what they were saying is that within this structure, when they try to give orders to new commanders, sometimes it's met with hostility from the new generation of Taliban. A few months ago in Paktia province, which is a Taliban area just outside of Kabul, Mullah Omar sent an emissary to a new Taliban commander to try to say that you're violating some of the rules of Taliban combat, and they literally murdered his emissary. So to give you a sense of what's happening, what the United States is doing through its night raids, where they're going into people's homes, they're corralling women, which is just anathema to the culture there, into one room, hooding men, zip tying their arms, helicoptering them to secret prisons. What they're doing is they're enraging populations throughout Afghanistan that wouldn't necessarily support the Taliban. So what you see happening is that the United States says, we're here to win hearts and minds. Their targeted killing campaign, the reliance on bad information from individuals in Afghanistan who are accusing their neighbors of being Taliban to settle personal grudges. The perception is that the United States government is just on a killing spree there, that they rarely get the right people. The Karzai government is utterly corrupt to the bone and exists only for the purpose of facilitating corruption. When you combine those things and then you look at the rhetoric coming from the Obama administration, the military, that we're there to win hearts and minds, you realize that the single greatest blows being dealt to the stated U.S. strategy in Afghanistan are being dealt by the U.S. itself through this targeted killing campaign.
Well, Jeremy, you begin the article talking about, in The Nation, talking about Mullah Sahib Jan, who apparently was offering to turn in his weapons with his fighters as part of the reconciliation campaign, and then you document what happened to him as an example of the contradictory U.S. policy.
Right. Well, when Rick and I were traveling down into these areas, we, by chance, one day were escorted by the son of a tribal leader in Logar province, and as we were coming back to Kabul after doing some stories and interviews that day, the driver just sort of said to us in passing, we were discussing, how local people are increasingly supporting the Taliban, even though they wouldn't be predisposed to do that. And he said, well, for instance, there was this imam that was killed in our area, and he had actually reconciled with the government. And being journalists, Rick and I, we'd never heard this before, and we started asking more questions, and we dropped what we were going to do the next day. We said we want to go to that imam's house. So we went to the home and we interviewed the sons of this man. And the story, Juan, basically is that last March, this guy who was a Taliban imam, Mullah Sahib Jan, entered the process of reconciliation with the Karzai government, brought in 50 Taliban fighters. They brought in a string of weapons that they handed over to the government. And then this mullah, this former Taliban imam, took a position with the local reconciliation council in Logar province. And according to the officials there that Rick and I interviewed, they would send him out into hardcore Taliban areas to try to preach to the Taliban that there were benefits to joining the government. They were offering them housing, jobs, and economic support in return for handing in their weapons. Well, 10 months later, Mullah Sahib Jan's bullet-riddled body was found about 500 yards from his house by his sons, who were escorted there by U.S. Special Operations Forces who had raided their home and gunned down Mullah Sahib Jan in the middle of the night. They tied up his sons. They put the women into one room. They kept his sons blindfolded and handcuffed for about 6 hours. And then a translator came to them and showed them a picture, and they said, this is the man that we killed, and it was their father. And when we talked to NATO, we talked to the U.S. military, they said they had no record of any operation of that sort. Anybody who knows anything about what's happening right now in Afghanistan knows that these night raids and these targeted killings go down all the time. And pretty much the only time that NATO puts out a release on it is if they're forced to do it by journalists proving that something took place, or if they think it benefits their psychological operations war. So the point of the story of Mullah Sahib Jan, and this is the takeaway that Rick and I had from this, was that if the United States is killing the very people who are doing what they say they should do, which is to reconcile, then the message that they're sending to people throughout Afghanistan is none of you are safe. Even if you leave the Taliban, you could be killed also in a targeted night raid.
And Rick, you've been to Afghanistan before. What have you the biggest change that you noticed in this trip?
Well, every time that I go to Afghanistan, the situation deteriorates. By every available metric, the U.S. is losing the war on the ground. The insurgency is gaining strength. Every time I go back, roads that were safe the trip before are no longer safe. Every time I go back, there are more, black districts in a province. I mean, those are districts where the Taliban are in control rather than the regional government. And I think because of this, because of the massive failure of the Obama troop surge, the U.S. has found itself caught in this bind where they have a completely self-defeating strategy. I mean, the stated public goal, there's near unanimity of the consensus inside the leaders of the U.S. military that there is no military solution to this conflict. There's only a political one, and so it's a counterinsurgency operation, fighting for hearts and minds. That's what they say publicly, but privately, I think they know that that's lost. And so what's going on in a parallel track to that is a program of assassination, of airstrikes and night raids, where whatever possible political gains were made by the counterinsurgency campaign during the day are erased at night by special operations forces. In 90 days over the summer, JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, conducted 500 operations in Afghanistan and claims to have killed or captured a couple thousand, high-level commanders. Now, I mean, what kind of organization, a guerrilla army, has 5,000 commanders? They're killing people way down to, minor sort of functionaries. It's war of attrition by special operations raid, and it's completely undermining the political campaign there.
Just to give you a sense also how this is going to play out at a practical level, when Rick and I were traveling along this major thoroughfare that the U.S. and NATO uses to bring in supplies to Kabul, the whole name of the game there is convoy protection. And we talked to tribal leaders that are right now playing both sides of the fence. They're getting money from the U.S. and NATO to keep their convoys safe, and part of what they have to do is pay the Taliban not to attack convoys on certain days. So it's a fundraising operation for the Taliban to be restrained in certain circumstances to not attack the convoys. But when night raids keep happening in these communities along this highway in the Pashtun heartland, the community leaders who are working with NATO are saying, we can't guarantee a year from now or 2 years from now that we're going to allow your convoys to pass safely. It's not that they want to join the Taliban. What they're saying is, if you keep disrespecting our women, if you keep killing our people, if you keep doing these night raids and targeted assassinations, if you keep relying on false information, we're going to withdraw that support for you because the money's not going to be worth it anymore. One of those community leaders who is helping to facilitate safe passage of NATO vehicles, a man named Haji Shokat, who Rick and I spent a lot of time with, was a former Mujahideen commander fighting against the Soviets and has the wounds to prove it on his body. He was saying to us, you ask anyone during the Soviet occupation era what it was like to try to go through our area. They could not pass. And if you look it up, Logar, this area, was one of the deadliest places for the Soviets in terms of convoys being ambushed. We interviewed several former Mujahideen commanders. These are not Taliban people. These are people that are working with the U.S. now that are saying, if they don't stop this, if they don't stop killing our people, we may actually attack these convoys or allow them to be attacked ourselves.
Who is in control of the Special Operations Forces? Who are they?
Well, the commander of JSOC, as Rick mentioned, the Joint Special Operations Command, from 2003 to 2008 was headed by General Stanley McChrystal. And when he became the ISAF commander in Afghanistan, he really brought this targeted assassination operation into full swing in Afghanistan. His successor is Admiral William McRaven, who is the current commander of JSOC. And JSOC is the force that operates pretty much, they're like Trump on The Apprentice. They fire at night. They're the guys that are out there killing at night and raiding the homes. And so if you hear about a night raid, it's almost always a JSOC force doing that. And they oftentimes aren't even reporting to the rest of the chain of command what they're doing. Rick and I traveled to Nangarhar province, which is and Jalalabad is the major commercial city near the Pakistani border, and Rick had been there before, where he's covered these night raids from Special Operations Force as well. And we returned to some of the areas that Rick had been to initially, where people were so angry that they wouldn't really talk. We talked to more people there.
Rick, if you could describe that.
Yeah, well, in this one neighborhood, which is not a Taliban stronghold at all, there had been, over the course of a couple of months, 4 Special Operations Forces raids that all appear on the surface to have been conducted on bad intelligence and to have killed innocent people. I mean, these are not, and the only reason we know about these stories is because the families involved were connected, educated families who were participating in the government, not the kind of people who would be part of the Taliban insurgency at all. So the one compound we visited